All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and very happy to be with you all here this evening. Sorry to hear that Ray's on his last leg, but hey, at least he looks good. So, yeah, I guess I don't expect too much in the way of comments from you tonight, Ray, but that's all right. So, 2 weeks ago, we had a look at Ahab, and tonight we're going to look at Asa and Jehoshaphat. If you recall, we talked about Ahab, hopefully from a slightly different perspective than what many of you have looked at him before, in terms of what some of his other characteristics were. He was a brave warrior. He was a wily politician. He was an international diplomatist, and he, could on occasion believe God, obey God, exercise himself in faith. But as we know, he ranks as by far one of the wickedest kings of either Judah or Israel. And one point before we move on to Asa and Jehoshaphat I'd like to make is that in many respects, Ahab's relationship to God was transactional. And what I mean by that is Ahab would obey God if God was helping him. And that Ahab thought that was just fine to do. And, as we, go through the Bible and look at different Bible characters, we come across individuals like this who had this very, kind of rudimentary concept of, how to serve God. And it really boiled down to, as long as I get something straight away, I'm okay. I'll do what God tells me to do. As soon as it looks like I'm not going to accomplish my own ends by obeying God or believing in Him, then I'm going to try something else. But it's a very selfish, you might say, self-absorbed approach to worshiping God, and unfortunately, it's probably a little more common than we'd like to admit. And undoubtedly, during the course of our own lives, I know there have been times when I've, in a way, looked at my life and thought, oh, God, if you just cut me a break here or do something for me or help me out of this jam, I'm going to be extra faithful or extra obedient or whatever, try to strike a deal with God. And that's not right. We know it's not right. Other examples we could look at if, on another occasion is a guy like Joab, David's nephew and right-hand man. Joab, a very complex character, but he was also very transactional in his relationship with God. So something to look at a later date. So tonight, Asa and Jehoshaphat are the third and fourth kings of the divided kingdom of Judah. So as we know, the northern kingdom was turned over to Jeroboam. But God had said, because of my covenant with my servant David, I will save him two tribes, and those two tribes were Judah and Benjamin. And God was not going to remove David's family from the throne. Eventually, he was going to remove the whole kingdom, as we know, and that was the Babylonians. But that was not for another couple hundred years, 300 years. So Rehoboam, Solomon's son, followed the foolish advice of the young princes. He was not a particularly faithful king. His son Abijah, who came after him, also not particularly faithful. But along comes Asa. And Asa, in 2 Chronicles 14:2, Asa did what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord his God. And then, again, and this is very telling, in verse 17 of chapter 15, again, 2 Chronicles, although he did not remove idols from Israel, Asa's heart was fully committed to the Lord all his life. And as I mentioned last week, there are four good kings in Judah and Israel, and those four good kings are Asa, Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, and Josiah. And it is said of all these four kings that either that they did what was right according to all that their father David did, or that they were perfect or whole or complete for their entire lives. And it's helpful to have those divine assessments, because when we look at the lives of all four of these kings, we can find some pretty glaring faults. We can find some pretty bad mistakes. In Jehoshaphat's cases, we're going to see shortly, he kept making repeated mistakes in that he kept trying to create some kind of an alliance between himself and Ahab and his family. And we know how desperately wicked Ahab was, and even more wicked his wife Jezebel was. And Jehoshaphat had this compulsion, this desire to unite the kingdoms, and he went about it in a very unfortunate way. So, if we were just to have their lives presented to us without God's comment on their heart, we might not walk away thinking they were, much better than any other king. But these divine assessments are very important because they help us distinguish between sincere discipleship and someone who just is going along for the ride, so to speak. And of course, one of the great examples in Scripture of this is Lot. If it wasn't for what it says in Peter about, Lot's righteous soul was vexed by the wickedness of Sodom, we would have a very mediocre view of Lot. We would probably consider that whatever happened to him was his own fault. He was weak. He was, had no strong moral fiber. He lacked commitment. He lacked faith. We could go on and on about Lot. Sometimes we do. But that's not what the Bible says about him in the end. God has a very glowing description of Lot. And, then we can go back and look at his life and his decisions in maybe a different light. And I think what's very helpful about the consideration for all of us is our lives are really going to look a lot like the lives of these flawed men. None of us obviously can bring perfect discipleship to the Lord Jesus. We need forgiveness. We do sin. We do fail. And often we kind of let all that trip off our tongue. Oh, yeah, I need forgiveness. Oh, I sin. I fail. La-di-da. And we can, if we speak in general terms, we kind of, push the accountability off to the side. But we all know that when we make mistakes, it's very challenging for us to accept the consequences of those, or to accept responsibility, or to admit fault, or to seek someone's forgiveness, or to, confess it openly that, we did this wrong thing. And the reality is, we've all been there and we've all struggled with that. So that when we look at the lives of these righteous men, they're very encouraging to think that these men made some pretty bad mistakes, but in the end, they held fast and they stayed very committed to God. And I think that's really what's demanded of all of us, is that we hold on to faith. If we went to Hebrews, he that cometh unto God must believe that he is, and is the rewarder of them that diligently seek him. And that's very simple. We need to maintain a belief in God and look forward to the reward he has to offer, and let that, walk with us for our entire lives. And if we can do that and endure into the end, we've actually accomplished a lot, because we're dealing with a lot of, built-in weakness, which burdens us every day. So anyway, we have this assessment of Asa, and Asa comes to the throne, and he throws himself into reforming the nation. Rehoboam and Abijah had let a lot of bad practices come into the nation. So back in 2 Chronicles 14, he removed the foreign altars and the high places, smashed the sacred stones, cut down the Asherah poles. He commanded Judah to seek the Lord, the God of their fathers, and to obey his laws and commands. He removed the high places and incense altars in every town in Judah, and the kingdom was at peace under him. He built up the fortified cities of Judah, since the land was at peace. No one was at war with him during those years, for the Lord gave him rest. And what's really neat about Asa is he takes advantage of the quiet time and fortifies the nation. Verse 7 of 2 Chronicles 14, let us build up these towns, he said to Judah, and put walls around them with towers, gates, and bars. The land is still ours because we have sought the Lord our God. We have sought him, and he has given us rest on every side. So they built and prospered. And that's an amazing attribute that Asa had. He took advantage of the quiet time to build up and to fortify. And it reminds you what Paul says to the Ephesians, that you should edify one another. And that literally means to build up. And, very often we find that, life comes in a bit of a roller coaster. You get, times where you're, going up the mountain and things are steady and okay. And then suddenly you plunge down into an abyss and things are terrible and stressful. But what we have to appreciate is that when times are a little quieter and a little more stable, those are the times we need to double down and really invest in fortifying ourselves spiritually, get into the meeting, attending the Bible class, developing relationships, strengthening our spirituality, because quiet times never last. And Asa knew that. He knew it wasn't going to last. There was too much turmoil going on in the world at this time. And we touched on that a little bit last time in regards to Ahab. So he made this commitment to prepare. And it was a fantastic attribute of Asa's. Now, one thing that is quite interesting, and this is going to come up over and over again as we look through the lives of these kings. Every good king that comes to the throne, it invariably says of him that he cleaned the place up, got rid of the high places, got rid of the false altars. These Asherah poles were cultic sites devoted to Ashtaroth, the fertility goddess. And, he gets them all out of the land. And yet they seem to reappear very quickly. And what I think, is helpful to consider is that, sometimes we look at the history of Israel and we think they went through prolonged periods of doing great, and then a long slide, and a long period of doing badly, and then a period of doing great, and then a period of doing badly. That's a little bit of a false perspective of what was going on in Israel. Yes, there were times when the nation was doing better than at other times, but at an individual level, there were people who always got it, Israelites who were always faithful. If we went back to the time of Ahab, if you recall, Elijah was told when he fled to the wilderness of Sinai that there were 7,000 knees that had not bowed to Baal in Israel. So even during Israel's darkest time, there were faithful men and women who persisted in the nation. But then there were always those who went with the flow. And if a good king like Asa came along and said, right, we're cleaning this place up, we're getting rid of these idols, we're cleansing the land, everyone would be, oh yeah, good on you, Asa, yeah, go for it. But in their hearts, they hadn't changed one wink. And as soon as a good king's back was turned, these characters would get right back at it. They'd rebuild the altars, put up the poles, repair the cultic sites, and go back to those practices. Bang, straight away. That's the human condition. That's people. That's us. We got to be honest with ourselves and acknowledge, like, am I in this or am I not? Am I just hankering for someone to turn their back so I can get back at it? Am I desperate to get away from the company of godly men and women so I can get stuck back into my bad habits? That's what we are. That's what these people were. And that's why as soon as, the king, as soon as a good king or good people relax their vigilance, these bad things would pop up immediately. because there was always that group who just was waiting to do it, never really converted. And it speaks to the importance of genuine, heartfelt conversion and internalizing these things and taking them on board in a very sincere sort of way. Then it doesn't matter who's at the top. We've made a commitment. We're going to stay the course. We're going to go the distance. As a blessing for Asa's faithfulness, later on in chapter 14, there's this huge army led by Zerah the Cushite. Anyway, without getting into a whole lot of history, this was a period in history when Egypt's power was beginning to wane. And Egypt for centuries had been, either the preeminent world power or one of two preeminent world powers. But as Assyria started to gain strength in the north, and the kingdom of Babylon began to become more over a period of time more independent and eventually preeminent as well, the Egyptians began to weaken in their influence on the world stage. And like I said before, it's very fascinating for me. I love history and how things never change. World powers come and go, and nations that were once on top of the pile for centuries eventually lose their grip on power. And this is what was happening to Egypt. So this Zerah the Cushite actually wasn't a pharaoh. He was apparently a general in the pharaoh's army. And it's one of the last times that the Egyptians are going to, put out such a massive army. And this massive army is destroyed by God for Asa's benefit and for the people of Judah. And they absolutely wiped these guys out. And they took away an incredible amount of booty. It says at the end of 14, verse 14 of chapter 14, they plundered all these villages since there was much booty there. They also attacked the camps of the herdsmen and carried off droves of sheep and goats and camels. Then they returned to Jerusalem. And what's interesting, I was doing a little background reading on it, is that if you recall, during Rehoboam's reign, Shishak, pharaoh of Egypt, came and took all of Solomon's treasures. I mean, that was a staggering amount of wealth. It all ended up in Egypt. The Egyptians were wealthy before, and they were even more wealthy when they looted the temple and the treasuries and all that had been Solomon's. So in a way, it was God's way of giving back to Judah some of the wealth that the Egyptians had carted off. So Asa is blessed with this great battle, this great victory. And in chapter 15, the Spirit of God came upon Azariah, son of Oded, and he encourages Asa. And if we had time to read through chapter 15, it goes on to talk about how Asa redoubled his efforts to secure the nation, to fortify the nation, to build up the nation. Verse 8, when Asa heard these words and the prophecy of Azariah, son of Oded, the prophet, he took courage. He removed the detestable idols from the whole land of Judah and Benjamin, from the towns he had captured in the hills of Ephraim, repaired the altar of the Lord that was in front of the portico of the Lord's temple. Then he assembled all Judah and Benjamin and the people from Ephraim, Manasseh, and Simeon, who had settled among them, for large numbers had come over to him from Israel when they saw that the Lord his God was with them. And what we're going to find is that over the next couple of kings, Judah increases in strength and its army gets bigger and bigger. So when we look at Jehoshaphat and the situation he inherited from Asa, he had an army of 1 million men. Now that wasn't a standing army, that was citizens who he could put into arms. But that was a huge force. It was things were going really well for Judah. And largely it was at the expense of the northern kingdom of Israel, because as we know, Jeroboam had set up the calf worship. He had discouraged Israel from going down to worship at the temple. And God was diminishing Israel's fortunes. And so when we get to this, relationship between Jehoshaphat and Ahab, if we recall what happened with Ahab when he was confronted by a large Syrian army, the Israelitish army was described as two little flocks of goats. And the reason for it is because there had been a hemorrhage of population to Judah. They realized that the godly men and women in Judah saw that there was righteous leadership or godly men and women in Israel, saw that there was righteous leadership in Judah, and they wanted to be near it. And it greatly enhanced the population and the success of the kingdom of Judah. So those were all great things. They were great blessings for Asa and for all that he was trying to accomplish. And then at the end of 15, he brought into the temple of God the silver and gold and the articles that he and his father had dedicated. There was no more war until the 35th year of Asa's reign. And then in chapter 16, we have this situation develop, which is really unfortunate. In the 36th year of Asa's reign, Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah in fortified Ramah to prevent anyone from leaving or entering the territory of Asa, king of Judah. So Baasha, who was the third king of Israel, is trying to stem the population hemorrhage, and it is making the border impenetrable and controlling the flow of people. And of course, this was something that Asa did not want to have happen. And for some reason, he gets it into his head that the best solution to this problem is to enlist another king, this Ben-Hadad, king of Syria or of Aram, who was ruling in Damascus. Now, why Asa felt that this was an appropriate thing to do, it's hard to say. He may have been hesitant to personally attack Baasha. He may have been hesitant to initiate conflict between Israel, because after all, they were brethren. There were many, Israelites living in Judah now. Maybe there was a kind of a strong public prejudice against doing something like that, because after all, you'd be fighting probably your relatives. So Asa felt that this was a good idea. So he sets up this treaty between himself and Ben-Hadad. And Ben-Hadad agrees to the terms, and he goes and he attacks Israel. And as a result, verse 5, when Baasha heard this, he stopped building Ramah and abandoned his work. Then King Asa brought all the men of Judah, and they carried away from Ramah the stones and timber Baasha had been using, and they built up Geba and Mizpah. So Asa, strikes this deal with Ben-Hadad, works to absolutely to a T. Ben-Hadad does what he's meant to do, distracts Baasha, this building project comes to an end, and people can move back and forth freely. Win-win for everyone, right? Well, not right. Because Asa is confronted by Hanani, another prophet, and he condemns Asa for doing this. And he says, because you relied on the king of Syria and not on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Syria or Aram has escaped from your hand. Were not the Cushites and Libyans a mighty army with great numbers of chariots and horsemen, yet you relied on the Lord, he delivered them into your hand. And this is one of my most favorite verses in the whole Bible. For the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. You have done a foolish thing, and from now on you will be at war. And the reason this is one of my favorite verses is because we often wonder, well, does God see other people? Is he engaged with other people? What about people who aren't Christadelphians or don't know us or we don't know them? We kind of get it all balled up in our heads. To me, this verse says something very compelling. It says that God doesn't miss any who are his. He looks throughout the earth for those who are committed to him. And I've always found it very reassuring to think that even though I don't know what's going on, and I barely know what's going on in my own backyard, God sees everything and he knows everything and he finds those who love him. Not our problem. God sorts it. God looks after that. And that was the message to Asa. The prophet was saying, look, Asa, I'm watching all that time. I saw what you were doing. I saw the little deal you struck. Oh, you thought it worked out great, Asa. You thought that was an amazing idea. Well, let me tell you, it was a terrible idea. Terrible. And you should know better. And you're going to have issues for the rest of your life. Now, the simple fact is, brothers and sisters, when we make the dumb choices we make on occasion, very often no one comes up to us and says those things. No, we don't have the benefit of a prophet saying to us, hey, Dave, dumb idea. What the heck were you thinking? You're really stupid. Now, if I was being honest with myself, I could look at myself in the mirror and say all those things. And sometimes I have. But sometimes it takes me a while to get to that point. But the reason we have stories like this in the Bible is so that we can see it work out. We can see how this good man made a bad choice and was really rebuked sharply for it and found out, just how it was that God worked and how he interacted with his creation, which, like I said, I find very encouraging. And unfortunately, Asa responded very angrily to this prophet. He was enraged. He put him in prison. And it says at the same time, Asa brutally oppressed some of the people. And unfortunately, the end of Asa's reign is a little bit of a downer. He had a disease in his feet. He did not seek to the Lord, but only the physicians. And then in the 41st year of his reign, Asa died. But the good that he had done for the nation is recognized at his death. They laid him on a bier, covered with spices and various blended perfumes, and they made a huge fire in his honor. So it's nice to see that even though he made some bad choices and bad mistakes and generated a bit of a bad attitude at the end, overall, the picture was a good one. And I think based on what it said about Asa, we can expect to see him in the kingdom. But he did make some bad choices. He had some pretty serious challenges. He did not respond well. He responded very emotionally to the criticism. And that was a real challenge for him. And I think for ourselves, brothers and sisters, it's such a powerful object lesson about the consequences of choices we make and how easy it is to become very emotional and really quite irrational in our reaction to some of the things that happen to us in life and things that get said to us and trying to be an honest self-evaluator. Those are very difficult things to do. Asa, struggled, didn't do so good in some of these departments and suffered personally for it. But it doesn't look like he's going to lose eternity because it's pretty evident from what is said that the man's fundamental faith did not waver, which, is good to know. And if we hadn't been told it, we might not recognize it. So any questions about Asa? Any questions about those reflections?
You're just saying you think he ends okay because earlier it says that he only placed his heart with the Lord?
Yeah, the Asa's evaluation is his heart was fully committed to the Lord all his life. And I think what we have to look at what he did at the end in that context, that there were certain things Asa did that were not consistent with his underlying belief and faith and commitment. That was unfortunate, but it wasn't a all-consuming loss of belief or loss of discipleship in his life. So, yeah, I think those assessments, those divine, you might say, the summaries of these Bible characters is very important because it's not everyone's impression of Asa, it's God's judgment of Asa. And, if we were basing our evaluation on our impressions, If we were one of the people he brutally oppressed, we might hate the guy's guts and think he was a big jerk. But then we wouldn't know the whole story, or we wouldn't know, everything that was going on in his heart. And that's the neat thing about having a biblical record about a person's life.
So it does mean when it says all his days, that's for sure means what it sounds like.
Yeah, I think that expression does mean that, because you get contrasting evaluations of kings. He was perfect, but not all the days of his life, or he served the Lord, but not with full commitment, or he did not serve the Lord like unto his father David. So when you contrast those statements with this statement, it's clear there's a distinction, that these other men, and they're not part of this current study, but you look at men like Jotham, Ahaziah, Joash in particular, Uzziah is another one. None of them are described as having served the Lord with a full commitment all their days. And it doesn't look like their mistakes are much worse than Asa's, but they have a real distinction in how they're evaluated. And that's really very much, like David and Saul. Everyone says, well, Saul doesn't look like he committed as bad a sin as David, but he's out, David's in. Why is that? Well, because there was something fundamentally different about their heart. Saul was a rebel. Saul was disobedient in a very protracted, fundamental sort of way. David wasn't. David made mistakes, but he came back. And I think, that's why I would conclude that Asa, died a faithful man. And the benefit to us is this faithful man had challenges and made mistakes. If that's helpful. Okay, well, keep plowing along and look at Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat actually inherits a fairly good situation from his father. He's able to build on the things that Asa had accomplished. And again, we have this evaluation of Jehoshaphat, which is very glowing. Verse 3 of 2 Chronicles 17. The Lord was with Jehoshaphat because in his early years he walked in the ways his father David had followed. He did not consult the Baals, but sought the God of his fathers and followed his commands rather than the practices of Israel. And then if you flip over, to 2 Chronicles 20, verse 31. So Jehoshaphat reigned over Judah. He was 35 years old when he became king of Judah, and he reigned in Jerusalem 25 years. Verse 32, he walked in the ways of his father Asa and did not stray from them. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And that was at the end of his life. So it was that kind of evaluation speaks to the underlying faith of Jehoshaphat. Anyway, getting back to chapter 17, can you just excuse me one sec? I gotta, Mayor, can I have some water, please? Water. Can't count on any of you guys getting me some water, so someone else is gonna have to give me some water.
We'll do it. We would if we could.
I know you would, I know. So at any rate, Jehoshaphat comes to the throne. He and he continues the different things Asa had begun. So again, picking up in verse 4 of chapter 17, he sought the God of his father, followed his commands rather than the practices of Israel. The Lord established the kingdom under his control. All Judah brought gifts to Jehoshaphat, so that he had great wealth and honor. His heart was devoted to the ways of the Lord. Furthermore, he removed the high places and the Asherah poles from Judah. Now, in verse 7, and to 9. Oh, thank you. He does something which is really awesome. In the 3rd year of his reign, he sent his officials, Ben-Hail, Obadiah, won't read all the names, to teach in the towns of Judah. With them were certain Levites, and he lists a bunch of Levites, and the priests, Elishama and Jehoram. They taught throughout Judah, taking with them the book of the law of the Lord. They went around to all the towns of Judah and taught the people. All right. So, like we saw in the time of Asa was physically fortifying the nation and also spiritually fortifying it. But Jehoshaphat takes it to another level. He sees the importance of the people being instructed in ways of righteousness. And he sets out a network of Levites overseen by a couple of priests to actively instruct the people, basically to set up a network of schools for people to become more aware and develop a greater understanding of the Word of God. And it really speaks, it really speaks to Jehoshaphat's commitment and his love of the ways of the Lord, that he wanted these imparted to the people in a very real sort of way. Now, this was a job the Levites should have been engaged in anyway. This was a Levitical responsibility. But as we know, the Levites were just as prone to not doing what they were supposed to as much as the rest of the nation. So Jehoshaphat makes a special commitment to reinvigorating this role and recommitting the Levites to this task. And once they were settled in the nation, or in the land, they had become a nation, the things that the Levites did in the wilderness weren't needed anymore. So, apart from those serving at the temple, what were they to do? Well, this is what they were to do. They were the teaching class. They were the instructors. They were judges. They were scribes and all these other worthy things. So to Jehoshaphat's credit, he really organizes this and makes sure it's getting done. And that was a great service to the nation. Now, in chapter 18, we come across a situation which represents Jehoshaphat's lifelong obsession, and that is his desire to form alliances with the northern kingdom. And I don't know for Jehoshaphat that it, whether it was Ahab or anybody else, it's just that Ahab happened to be the king at this time. And we know that Jehoshaphat had established a marital alliance with Ahab. His son Jehoram had married Ahab's daughter Athaliah, and that was just going to have terrible consequences later on, because after Jehoshaphat was dead and his son Jehoram came to the throne, and then Jehoram died, and his son Ahaziah came to the throne, and he died. Then Ahaziah's mother Athaliah took over and reigned for 8 years as this horribly wicked queen, and slaughtered all the household of David, all the children. She was really up there when it comes to the baddies of world history. She was a bad lady. And unfortunately, Jehoshaphat set this in motion with a very ill-advised decision, but he did it, and then he goes and he forms a military alliance with Ahab, and this is the subject of chapter 18. This is when Ahab is going to war again against the Syrians, and he asks Jehoshaphat to join him, and off Jehoshaphat goes. And it's a real fascinating interaction, because Jehoshaphat wants them to inquire of the Lord. And so verse 5 of chapter 18, so the king of Israel brought together the prophets, 400 men, and asked them, shall we go to war against Ramoth Gilead, or shall I refrain? Go, they answered, for God will give it into the king's hand. And I mean, this is almost a bit comical. It's a bit of a black comedy. But Jehoshaphat asked, is there not a prophet of the Lord here whom we can inquire of? Ahab trots out 400 prophets. Jehoshaphat looks at him and goes, nah, not these guys. He knew right away these characters were bogus. And, you have to ask yourself, Jehoshaphat, time to pack your bag and go home. This is not where you need to be. But, Jehoshaphat was in, and he was having a hard time getting himself out. So in response to that, Ahab says to Jehoshaphat, there is still one man through whom we can inquire of the Lord, but I hate him because he never prophesies anything good about me, but always bad. He is Micaiah, the son of Imlah. And this has got to be by far one of the lamest responses to finding yourself in a compromising situation. Jehoshaphat says, and I'll quote it from the King James, he says, let not the king say so. Or as it says in the NIV, the king should not say that. Now, I can only imagine that Jehoshaphat said it in a way that was pretty ineffective, kind of like, Ahab, don't say that. That's not nice. Really, it has got to be one of the most cringe-worthy moments in history, where this good man Jehoshaphat is hanging out with this bad guy Ahab, and when Ahab's bad keeps coming to the surface over and over again, Jehoshaphat just finds himself in this, ouch moment. But, there he is, put himself there. And so the king of Israel says, bring Micaiah out. And, it would, be well worth everyone's time and energy to go through the whole thing. But by the end of it all, Micaiah says to Ahab, you are going to die in this battle. And of course, this is after the events that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. This is after Naboth and the vineyard and all the, bad things. This is at the end of Ahab's reign, the end of his life. And Ahab's mad, of course, and he sends the guy back to prison. So again, kind of ranking as one of history's great ironic moments. Verse 28, sorry, that's my phone. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, went up to Ramoth Gilead. The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, I will enter the battle in disguise, but you wear your royal robes. I mean, really? Nice guy. Jehoshaphat, time to go. He didn't go. He stayed. And he stayed right to the bitter end. And the remarkable thing is that God seemed to take pity on Jehoshaphat and saved him from the Syrians, who of course thought he was Ahab because he was the only guy out there who looked like a king. And so God, preserved Jehoshaphat's life. And then verse 33, then someone drew his bow at random and hit the king of Israel between the sections of his armor. And he was disguised. He just looked like any other soldier. The king told the chariot driver, wheel around and get me out of the fighting. I have been wounded. Now, you're going to probably think, oh, Dave, you're straining at gnats here and swallowing camels. But in all fairness to Ahab, the man was a man of courage and bravery, because all day long the battle raged. The king of Israel propped himself up in his chariot, facing the Arameans until evening. Then at sunset he died. He wasn't a coward. He wasn't gutless in that sense. I mean, he was horribly wounded. He was dying. He knew he was dying, but he refused to be withdrawn from the battle. He stayed. And he had to get out of the heat of the fighting because he wasn't able to fight anymore, but he did stay and watch the whole thing go down. So he could have fled. He could have run. He didn't. He stayed. Got to give the man some credit when credit's due, but not a good guy. Anyway, he dies, and Jehoshaphat returns back to Judah, and he's confronted by the son of the man who condemned his father Asa, Jehu the seer, the son of Hanani. And Hanani was the one who went after Asa. And this son of Hanani says, should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Because of this, the wrath of the Lord is upon you. There is, however, some good in you, for you have rid the land of the Asherah poles and have set your heart on seeking God. So just like his father, Asa makes his bad mistake. Now, in contrast to Asa, Jehoshaphat does not respond with antagonism. In actual fact, Jehoshaphat uses the opportunity to recommit himself to this task of educating the people and establishing this network of administration. Because if we read 4 through 8, right to the end of the chapter, this section from 4 to the end of the chapter, in chapter 19, is all about Jehoshaphat's attempts to provide faithful instruction, righteous judgment, good judges for the people. And verse 10, in every case that comes before you from your fellow countrymen who live in the cities, whether bloodshed or other concerns of the law, commands, decrees, or ordinances, you are to warn them not to sin against the Lord. Otherwise, his wrath will come upon you and your brothers. Do this and you will not sin. So Jehoshaphat accepts the condemnation, accepts the criticism, and remains fully committed to his program of instruction in godliness. And then in chapter 20, he's once again confronted, he's confronted with this invading force, and he responds with phenomenal faith. He knows that there's no point in lifting an arm on their own behalf, and instead they sing hymns to God, and God affords them a great victory. So, Jehoshaphat has this, amazing response to criticism, which is, really such a powerful example and such a great thing to do, that he was, he recognized he had made a mistake. Now, the only thing is, and that was really good of Jehoshaphat, but he did on 4 occasions during the course of his life involve himself with the family of Ahab. He marries his son to Athaliah. He goes into battle with Ahab. And then at the end of chapter 20, later Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, in verse 35 of 2 Chronicles 20, made an alliance with Ahaziah, king of Israel. So this was Ahab's son, who was guilty of wickedness. He agreed with him to construct a fleet of trading ships. These were built at Ezion-Geber, which was way down in the south. Eliezer, son of Dodavahu of Mareshah, prophesied against Jehoshaphat, because you have made an alliance with Ahaziah, the Lord will destroy what you have made. The ships were wrecked and were not able to set sail. So, it was something that Jehoshaphat kept falling into, and it was this desire to somehow build bridges between Judah and Israel. And there was one other example of when he did this, and this is even after this incident. If you turn back to 2 Kings, this is Kings 3, and this is the reign of Jehoram, son of Ahab. So Ahab died in battle. His son Ahaziah came to the throne. He lasted a couple years. And then Ahaziah didn't appear to have a son, so his brother Jehoram reigns. He reigned for about 11 years. Anyway, during Ahab's reign, he had subjugated the kingdom of Moab and made them pay tribute. And when Jehoram came to the throne, Moab rebelled. So in 2 Kings 3, verse 4, now Mesha, king of Moab, raised sheep and had to supply the king of Israel with 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But after Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. So at that time, King Jehoram set out from Samaria and mobilized all Israel. He also sent this message to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah: the king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to fight against Moab? And Jehoshaphat says, I will go with you, he replied. I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses. So, Jehoshaphat finds himself back in the very same situation as he did with Ahab. In verse 11, Jehoshaphat asked, "Is there no prophet of the Lord here, but we may inquire of him?" Same problem. Remarkably enough, Elisha is around. An officer of the king of Israel answered, "Elisha, son of Shaphat, is here. He used to pour water on the hands of Elijah." Jehoshaphat knew of Elisha, said, "The word of the Lord is with him." And Elisha in verse 14 says, "As surely as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, if I did not have respect for the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not look at you or even notice you." So anyway, without getting into all the details of the story, the point is that over the course of his lifetime, Jehoshaphat kept doing this thing. And you might ask yourself, what were you thinking? Why do you keep going back to this, bad idea? You do it with Ahab, you do it with his son, your son and his daughter, you do it with his son Ahaziah, you do it with his son Jehoram. What are you thinking? Well, I think there's a couple of suggestions. One is that even though Ahab and his family were wicked people, they were still Israelites. They were still brethren. And Jehoshaphat seemed to have this idea that, this rupture between the kingdoms was so bad that even aligning himself with a wicked representative of Israel was better than doing nothing at all. So there was this constant attempt on Jehoshaphat's part to bridge the gap and bring these two nations together. I think the other problem Jehoshaphat had was that he was probably a little too confident in his ability to carry the day, and the reforms he had implemented in Judah he would then be able to impose on Israel in some form or another. And of course, one way of doing that is to create like a dynastic union. So if you marry your son and the daughter, then possibly the children of that union will then have a claim to both kingdoms. So, once that was all in place, then there would be an opportunity to impose a righteous and godly agenda on the northern kingdom. So I'm personally convinced that these must have been some of the ideas in Jehoshaphat's head, why he kept persisting in this interaction with the house of Ahab. But when you step back and look at this situation, there were two things that Jehoshaphat should have remembered. Is that one, the split was of God, period. God split the nation. Now, it looked like it was, Rehoboam's stupidity, but that was of God, and God said so. So, we often like to talk about, when people get married, what God hath put together, not let man part asunder. That's great, fair enough. Well, sometimes when God parts something asunder, it's not our job to put it back together. And in this instance, God had split the nation. It wasn't Jehoshaphat's job to put it back together. It was God's job, and he had someone in mind to do it, and that was Jesus. And we could go to a prophecy in Ezekiel, which says exactly that there will be two sticks and they'll be bound together. One is Israel, one is Judah. God's job, not our job, not Jehoshaphat's job. And the other lesson that Jehoshaphat needed to realize, and this comes out in Haggai, where, they ask Haggai about a provision in the law, and the provision in the law was if something unclean touches a vessel or an object, is that vessel or object made unclean? And the answer is yes, it's made unclean. But if something holy touches an object, is that object made holy? And the answer is no, it's not made holy. And the point is that righteousness is not communicable, but evil is. Now, obviously, we want righteousness to be communicable. We work at righteousness being communicable. We hope it's communicable, but evil spreads much more rapidly than good does. And that's the point of that little lesson. And Jehoshaphat had to have less confidence in his ability to overcome evil with good when the parties he was trying to influence were wholly committed to doing something bad. That's what the problem was. Ahab and his family were just bad people. They were evil men and women. You weren't going to help them. They kept making bad choices over and over again. And all your goodness and all your positivity and all your good ideas, Jehoshaphat, were not going to change their minds. They had set their course. And really, the only thing Jehoshaphat could have done is said, look, I'd love to help you guys out. I'd love to be there. I'd love to make this better, but that's not going to happen. And it was unfortunately a lack of wisdom and perception on Jehoshaphat's part that led him into this situation. He personally retained his integrity. He retained his righteousness. He retained his faith. He did not lose that. All right. So Jehoshaphat wasn't some weak-willed person who walked into a situation and, oh yeah, let's worship Baal. Let's worship Asherah. Let's go do all this dumb stuff. No. That wasn't Jehoshaphat. He wasn't at risk personally from the influence of Ahab's family. But that was him. It wasn't other people, other situations. He needed to keep as much distance between himself and that family as he possibly could. You could not help them. They did not want to be helped. And to me, it's a very powerful object lesson that we need to appreciate our limits and our ability to fix this situation. And some situations aren't ours to fix. And, very often in our interactions with people, or, it could be close family members, it could be situations in our ecclesia, it could be individuals who have left the meeting, and we just have this overwhelming desire to fix it. Can't I fix it? Can't I help it? Can't I make this thing better? And, we can overstep our capacity and make things a lot worse when we don't see a situation for what it is. The thing that Jehoshaphat needed to do was just follow some very basic principles. Just keep it simple, Jehoshaphat. It's like the KISS rule, keep it simple, stupid. That's what Jehoshaphat lost sight of. Keep it simple. These are not good people. Stay away. Yes, they're your brethren in a technical sort of a way. Yes, the kingdom should be united. Yes, it will be united someday. Jehoshaphat knew all of that. But it wasn't the right time or the right place. And he just didn't, he just wasn't getting that. He wasn't appreciating it, or he just didn't want to believe it. And so he kept stumbling into this situation over and over again. And it was very unfortunate. But again, it's an example of a godly man making bad choices. Great motivation, great end goal, but not the right time. And, like many things in life, timing's everything. Or I guess if you're selling real estate, location. A lot of things in life are governed by some simple things. And this was a simple thing. And Jehoshaphat forgot to follow a simple rule. And it's a rule we all need to be able to take on board. And all the good that we'd like to do in life, very often we can't do. But if we can't exercise, if we can't help out one situation, no problem. Find a situation we can help. There's always plenty to do. There's no sense in sitting down and feeling frustrated. Go do something you can do. Find someone who is receptive. Look for a situation that will respond to our love, our love of the truth, our interest in the Bible, our belief in the Lord Jesus Christ. There's someone out there, but beating our heads against a brick wall, we don't get anything done, and we just end up hurting ourselves. So that is very evident in Jehoshaphat's life. And the good thing about Jehoshaphat is he could take it on the chin. When he got criticized, bam, you're right, I made a mistake again. Sorry. Asa, a little more resistant to that. Jehoshaphat took it like a champ. So, two godly men, different responses, different challenges, but nonetheless, powerful examples for ourselves. So any questions on any of that? That was a lot of information, I know, but these are great chapters in the Bible. I mean, just take some time, read through them, ponder them. Great stuff.
It's not easy when you've laid it out like this, but it's not always so simple to sort of realize that there's people that sometimes you have to park from or whatever. But I guess
Right.
the point is continued behavior that doesn't change should be assigned to us that, you know, that it's maybe, it's like the Pharisees with Jesus. I mean, he continued to try and work with them, but there was a point when he said, you're whitewashed sepulchers, you know,
Right.
woe to you and all that kind of thing, because if people over time refuse to be different, then like
Right.
you say, we should invest in more profitable things, but
Right.
it's hard to develop the kind of wisdom to have confidence in doing that, I feel like.
Yeah.
Over time and experience, then you sort of start seeing it more clearly.
Right.
But he didn't.
No, and you're absolutely right. And, you know, Jehoshaphat was in a situation. I mean, I've often thought, you know, if I find myself saying to myself, oh, no, don't say that, or oh, that's uncomfortable, or, you know, I feel ill at ease. I mean, that's a warning sign, you know. It's like the robot in Lost in Space. Warning, warning, warning. You know, I shouldn't be here. This is not helpful. No one's listening to me. Everyone, you know, this situation's on a completely different, you know, track. I'm not going to bring it around. No one wants it brought around. Time to go. And and there's absolutely no problem in looking at a situation and saying, this is beyond me. I'm going to keep praying for you. I'm going to keep praying for this situation, but I can't be here. I can't help you. And you know, very often these are situations where, you know, like you say, people make repeated choices. They're the same bad ones over and over again. They've heard it a million times, what they're doing wrong and what they need to do. Don't want to hear it. Hey, you know, we're going to have to part company for a while. That's okay.
Do you have the references by any chance for that, Ezekiel and Haggai?
Yeah. So the Ezekiel, Ezekiel is in the you know, prophecies of the restoration, and I think the yeah, so in Ezekiel 37, verse 15, the word of the Lord came to me, son of man, take a stick of wood and write on it belonging to Judah, and the Israelites associated with him, then take another stick of wood and write on it Ephraim, belonging to Joseph and all the house of Israel. So that's Ezekiel 37, beginning at verse 15, is the prophecy of the two sticks. And then Haggai is Haggai 2, 10 to 14. It's this is what the Lord Almighty says, ask the priest what the law says if a person carries consecrated meat, and then it goes on to, you know, talk about, you know, what is made holy and what is made unholy. And
What was that verse?
so that's Haggai 2, beginning in verse 10. It's 10 to 14. And it talks about how defilement works under the laws. So it's much more easy to defile something than to make it clean. So the lesson is that evil is communicable, like Olive Ray's communicable diseases that he's carrying around right now. Or, oh no, he's not contagious. Sorry, Ray. And you know, that evil is communicable, righteousness is not. So Jehoshaphat was trying to communicate righteousness, and the defilement was too bad. He was not making that situation clean. That's the connection.
All right, well, thank you very much, David, for your information this evening.
Yeah. Hope that was helpful.
Yep. If you'd like to go ahead and close the prayer, we'll finish up for the evening.
Sure. So let us pray. Father, we thank you for another opportunity to open your book, to consider it, to study it, to be encouraged by the examples of godly men and women, and certainly encouraged by the fact, Father, that all of us as servants try and sometimes fail, but we have forgiveness in your Son, and we're so thankful we do. Help us to grow wiser daily and to discern between good and evil. And bless us as we go our separate ways. We long for your Son's return and pray that it will soon be upon us. We offer this in his name, even Jesus Christ. Amen.
All right, well, thank you. We appreciate it.
No, thanks very much, everyone, for your kind attention.
Okay, we're
Okay.
rolling. We will see you next week.
Yep, see you next week. Yeah, okay, bye. Night.